welcome to another episode of Bury Our Bones with Cinema, the podcast that lives, breathes and dies both classic movies and the films that we wish were never made. In today's episode, we take a leisurely stroll through video game adaptations that just got it right. So let's double check we have enough space on the memory card, charge up our favourite controller, and of course, save an unnecessary amount of time to ensure that we don't lose any progress. It's time to bury our bones with cinema.
Visit the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium for all your citrus fruit needs. Visit us in-store to peruse our limitless supply of Burmese citrus fruits, plus browse our selection of Lunchables. Or shop online using discount code I Bloody Told You to receive a 10% discount on our lean, mean tangerine machine for all your juicing needs. That's the Michael Caine Tangerine Emporium, Bond Street, London, England. We have tangerines the size of rubies.
It's that time again. Welcome back to another episode of Bury Our Bones with Cinema. And as the intro mentioned, we are going to be looking at video game adaptations that got it right. Obviously, following on from our last episode where we looked at video game adaptations that got it wrong. Today, it's going to be a slightly more positive episode, and we're going to look at some of those hidden gems that we call video game adaptations that are actually quite good, because they are quite few and far between. You know, as we kind of alluded to in the last episode, generally speaking, video game movies haven't been a great assortment to choose from. There's usually only one or two or a couple or a handful of good films. They're mostly, you know, rather dull affairs that don't really know, you know, what they're trying to achieve. But in this episode, it's going to be those good ones. It's going to be a slightly more positive episode. So I'm going to kick off straight away, get straight into the meat on the bone, and we're going to look at some honourable mentions. Now, the first kind of two that I'm looking at, actually, well, three actually technically, is I'm going to look at the Tomb Raider films, which, look, I'm not going to sit here and say that they're Oscar worthy and that they, you know, they're absolute masterclasses of cinema, because they're not. But I do think they are rather enjoyable affairs. I think you've got the, you know, the two Angelina Jolie versions. Haven't seen them in a long time, but from what I remember, they were enjoyable flicks. I think Angelina Jolie was a semi-decent casting of Lara Croft. You know, has that that appeal that I think the character from the games has. And then more recently, I think 2016, 2018, one of those years, can't quite remember, we've got the Alicia Vikander one. I think that's how you say her name. I do apologise if I'm getting that wrong. Which was, again, an enjoyable flick. Again, not going to set the world on fire, but it was certainly in that positive area when it comes to video game adaptations. And that's all I'm going to look at when it comes to honourable mentions, because there's going to be a few others that we may get onto later on in the series, but I'm not going to go into too much depth there. I'm going to leave you thinking about that mystery just there. But the first film that I think we should focus on is going to be in the survival horror genre, and it's going to be Silent Hill. Okay, so it's from 2006, a Silent Hill film based on the game of the same name. Now, I remember watching this back in 2006-ish, 2007, relatively shortly after it came out, and I thought it was a fairly decent film. And I kind of didn't really return to it until couple of weeks ago when I was preparing this episode, and I thought, right, what's a video game adaptation that works, that I think is good? And I thought, oh, that Silent Hill film, that was pretty good. I know there was a sequel, which I haven't seen, so I'm not going to comment on that one, but I have seen the first Silent Hill film, and I thought it was a pretty decent film. You know, I think part of the positives of it is that it does create a very ominous feel to the town of Silent Hill. I think when you have a film where the name of the film is the place that most of the action or most of the most of the script takes place in. You have to be able to properly really be able to create that world and really sort of make sure that the world that is created is really really strong, because I think otherwise it just feels a little bit happenstance, rather than it being actually this warrants a whole film being made around this particular place. And I think much like the game, which I haven't played in, I would say, at least 20 years, if not longer. Certainly the early 2000s is when I last played the first game. And actually now it's quite difficult to play. It's quite difficult to, not because of the controls or anything like that, but just because it's become quite a collector's item. It's quite rare. If you want to pick up the first game, you've got to pick it up on the PlayStation rather than picking it up on I suppose you could pick it up on an emulator or something like that, but I don't really go into that market. But if you want to pick up, an actual copy of the game, you've got to pick it up on PS1. That's the only, as far as I'm aware anyway, probably getting loads of gamers saying, no, there's actually this version, but as far as I'm aware, it's only the PS1 version. And actually, if you're looking to pick that up second hand, you're looking at, upwards of £100 for a PS1 game, which I can't justify. And I know a lot of people listening won't be able to justify, but collectors can. But yeah, so it's been a long time since I played the game. So trying to work out, is this faithful to the games was a little bit tricky. But I think one of the things that Silent Hill, the film in 2006, does well is it creates enough of a world that stands alone, that works on its own merit. It's not necessarily, obviously there will be those nods and those things that are specific to those fans and, looking at those Easter eggs almost type of thing. But there is enough to pull people in who haven't played the game. I think if you were to just go and watch it, not play the game, not even know what the game is, people like my parents, for example, my mum anyway likes a horror film. She doesn't know what the game is. She's never going to play the game, and she would watch that film. I think she has watched it. I have to get her opinions on it. But she would watch that film and say, it's pretty good. That works on its own. Doesn't need to know, oh, well, this is this from this game and this is that from that game. Doesn't need to know any of that. And I think that's what works quite well. I think, comparing it to the Street Fighter and the Assassin's Creed films, that's what they kind of missed, is that it didn't quite work for those fans for those viewers who weren't fans of the game. So I think Silent Hill does that quite well. I think, as I say, some of those early shots where they first go into Silent Hill and it has that, that hazy look, that ash falling from the sky and a very, very misty, foggy kind of area, that creates the look of the first game and even the second game, from memory anyway. It creates that look quite well. It creates it, and for people of the game who perhaps don't know, the reason why that was the look of the game is because that was part of the capabilities of the PlayStation. If they didn't have that, all you would see is, I think, not far in front of you, and it would be that polygon kind of pixelated view beyond that. So they created that fog to kind of cloud that, and that ended up hitting upon something genius in the meantime. But I think the film, creates that quite well. When you first see the characters go into Silent Hill, we are there and we're going, this feels ominous. Doesn't feel like a good place to go, which we know it's not going to be because it's a horror film, but we get that feeling come across through the celluloid when we're watching it. So we're going to backtrack slightly and we're going to look at the budget and the box office. We're going to look at the film crew, ratings, etc., before we get onto the meat of the bone and why I think this is a good video game adaptation. So kicking off with the budget. So obviously this was released in April 21st, 2006, and it had a budget of 50 million, which for a horror film in 2006 is a sizable chunk of change. Not many, particularly not films on their own series. I think perhaps a lot of the budget would have because it's an intellectual property that's already existed. It comes from the games that people are hoping it creates that, that demand for it. So 50 million for a horror film is not to be sniffed at. And in its opening weekend, it made just over $20 million, which again is a good return. Gross US and Canada only 46 million, but I think obviously this game or film being based on a game that was made by Konami, is going to be looking at, that Japanese market and the more Asian market, I would have thought. And it kind of comes across when you see the worldwide, it made $100 million compared to US and Canada only making $46 million or thereabouts. So they doubled their budget, but virtually they doubled their, they made back 100 million. So that, take off advertising costs, probably looking at about $30 million profit, which probably it was enough for a sequel. So obviously something worked. And in horror films, that's quite good. I think usually horror films are looking to create a franchise. They're quite easy to make and come back and come back and come back and come back. Sometimes to the detriment of whatever it is, whatever universe it's a part of. But this done enough to get a sequel. So this was directed by Christoph Gans. It was written by Roger Avery. That was a screenplay, obviously. The producers were Don Comodi and Samuel Hadida. Composers were Jeff Dannett and Akira Yamaoka. The cinematographer was Dan Louston. Editor was Sebastian Prangier. I think I'm pronouncing that right. I do apologise again if I'm not. I think it goes without saying, whenever we are pronouncing names that aren't in our native tongue, we do apologise if we get the pronunciation wrong there, but we do try our best. So the casting director was Deirdre Bowen, and the production designer was Carol Spear. So, not too many names there that I've recognised prior to this film, or indeed since. So again, sometimes that can work in a film's favour, because you're not going into it with a predisposition as to what to expect. If this was directed by Wes Craven, for example, I'd get an idea of what I expect from a Wes Craven film. And I think having sometimes a little bit of an unknown, or somebody who you're not familiar with, I'm not saying that they were an unknown, but I certainly wasn't familiar with them. If we, have a quick look at the cast of Silent Hill, I think there will be some names that people recognise. So in the starring roles, we have Rada Mitchell playing Rose Da Silva. We have Sean Bean playing Christopher Da Silva. And shock, horror and spoiler, Sean Bean doesn't die in this film. It's one of the only films where Sean Bean doesn't die. That is in itself a rare item. We've got Laurie Holden playing Sybil Bennett. We've got Deborah Kara Unger playing Dahlia Gillespie. We've got Kim Coates playing Officer Thomas Gucci. We've got Tanya Allen playing Anna, Alice Kriege playing Christabella, and Jadale Ferland playing Sharon Alessa. So, a good cast, I think, is always a good thing to have, naturally. I think here, obviously, we've got a couple of recognisable names. So Laurie Holden, who plays Sybil Bennett, that's the female police officer in the film. People will probably most know her from The Walking Dead. Kim Coates is an actor who I think was in Sons of Anarchy, probably where people will most know him from. But he's one of those supporting characters who crops up in a lot of things. So people recognise him. Obviously, Sean Bean is Sean Bean, for particularly English listeners will know him quite well from many different BBC dramas, things like Sharp and obviously Lord of the Rings. But Sean Bean is perhaps the biggest star in this film. Rada Mitchell, I recognise, and I couldn't think what she'd been in prior to this or after this. But again, a recognisable face. And we obviously, I think one thing to be said, obviously we have Jodelle Ferland playing Sharon and Alessa. I always say when working with children in films, it is it's a poison chalice. Sometimes you have to do it. Sometimes it works. Sometimes it doesn't work. I think this is a film where I'm not going to say it necessarily is revolutionary in the way it does it, but it certainly doesn't detract away from the film in that respect, which is obviously a positive. It's very, very difficult sometimes to use children in films and it not be distracting. And it's a tricky thing to navigate. Sometimes the kids can get annoying. Sometimes they can not be very good performers or actors. But I think in this instance, it works, more than well. And I think, looking at the ratings, which, it's always a good kind of barometer of what people are feeling about the film. It's always a good way of exploring, views and, how it's been received. IMDb score of 6.5 out of 10, which is a fairly decent, solid score. As I say, it's not in that upper stratosphere of those 7s or 8s, but as a 6.5 I deem to be a fairly decent score. Strangely, only 32% critics rating on Rotten Tomatoes, so for some reason the critics didn't kind of gel with this one, but in the audience score it's a 63%, so again in that similar sort of figure. So I don't think necessarily people will flock to watch this film. I don't think people will say this is a particularly revolutionary film. It's not necessarily a film that loads of people go to when they're talking about horror films. But I think what it is it's definitely a decent affair. And I think that for video game adaptations, I think a decent affair becomes, a very good affair for a video game adaptation, just because they're, as I alluded to in the title, good video game films are few and far between. There's not a lot. It's a handful, so it kind of makes sense. And actually, in researching this, I saw comments on message boards and articles where actually, as time has kind of gone on, this has been something that people have returned to and gone, actually, that's actually better than I thought it was. And actually people have changed their opinions on it slightly. We're talking about it in a slightly more positive light now in 2024 as we were in 2006. This is nearly, that's depressing. I've just realised it's an 18-year-old film, nearly 20 years old. So a little bit depressing in that regard, because I thought, in my head, 2006 was only a few years ago. Obviously not. But anyway, that's a different topic for another day. So how was this film made? Who made it? What were some of the things that went into it? We'll get onto that. But one thing I do want to say about this film is, strangely, usually when I watch a film, I just stick it on and I just watch it. And for some strange reason, I found this, although I'm saying it's a great film, I found it a difficult watch. I had to watch it in kind of 3 stages for some reason. It was difficult for me to kind of just sit down and watch it. Now, I don't think that's a bad thing, which is, I don't know, a bit strange to add, but I think the reason why is because a lot of the imagery in the film, and obviously that's taken from the game series, a lot of the imagery is actually quite hard to watch, quite difficult to watch. Now, it's not going to be, it's not the most graphic of things. It's not going to be the most shocking of things. But I think it was more the kind of interpretation of it, and the more you kind of look at things and the more you think about things is where it kind of gets a little bit difficult, a little bit, difficult to process. And I think that was what it was for me. I think there was a real kind of, this just isn't a very nice watch, but in that horror mindset, that's a good thing for what it is that this film is trying to do. So I kind of understood that, and I kind of got that, but it did take me, I watched it in sort of like, I watched an hour here, and then I watched another like half an hour, and then I finished off the film later on. And I think, as I say, a lot of the imagery that we see obviously is taken, or is taken from the games and developed a little bit further. But I think with the games, obviously, it was released on the PlayStation with limited graphics and limited technology to kind of tell that story. So seeing it actually in 2006 with, movie quality CGI, not the best CGI, but slightly more, a better form of CGI. I have to admit, I haven't played the second game, which I realise does have slightly better graphics and stuff like that. I've only really played the first game. Makes it a bit more difficult to watch, and I think that's partially because of the world in which this film creates. Christoph Gans was a dab hand at making sure that this stuff was not particularly nice. I'm thinking of the first kind of creature thing. I don't know what you call it. I know Silent Hill fans will say, yep, it's this, it's that. And obviously we come at a time where they've just announced a Silent Hill 2 remaster. But the first kind of creature that they meet with the armless and faceless, bodies, it's just watching it felt like, it's not the most grotesque of monsters that we've seen in horror films. It's not the most imaginative or anything like that. But the problem that I had with it is for me it just felt really sort of uncomfortable to watch this creature kind of hobbling towards the main characters with no face and no arms, and almost looking like it's trying to break out of this kind of, this skin almost. I just found that quite difficult, and I think that was, a testament to how, how the film has taken inspiration from the game and built on it slightly without getting to a point where it's something completely different. So I think it does that quite well. I think what's interesting is that the film, having said that, I needed to watch it in 3 stages. One thing that the film does quite well is it built upon it built upon the things that the game set up. So it never at any point did it always used it as an inspiration. Sometimes, pulled it in but it never felt as though they were just doing it for the sake of doing it, in my opinion, anyhow. One thing that I think is good about the film as well is that it has that, that plot line of Sean Bean's character searching for his wife and searching for his daughter. And what that does is it means that you're not all the time in that difficult place of Silent Hill, that difficult world that it creates. Because, and it's a fairly long horror film. It's 2 hours long, which for a horror film is on the longest, side of thing. Most, some other genres are more akin to 2-hour films, but generally speaking, horror films, are around 120, 140. So the reason it's able to kind of do that across the 2 hours is because it does keep going backwards and forwards between those 2 plot lines. So we're not all the time following Rose and Sharon and Alessa in their kind of struggle with this world and with this kind of nightmarish land that they're having to explore. We see enough of it, so it's not, it's not in a place where we want to see more, but we don't get it. So we see enough of it, but we're not in a place where we're going, we've seen too much of it. It's too much. I need to have a break from this particular thing. Ironically, I kind of still needed to have a break, but that's probably for slightly different reasons. I think as well, obviously they took, as far as I'm aware, the first game does kind of focus on it from the father's point of view, looking for, I believe, his daughter or his wife. They changed that so it's that part of the plot line is the secondary plot, and we actually see it mostly from Rose and the daughter's point of view, which I think again is usually the way to go with horrors, we usually see it from a female gaze, in the sense of they're the ones in peril, they're the ones who, it's a lot more believable. Not always, and it doesn't always work for every single film, but I think in this instance it does kind of work. I think if it had been 2 hours of Sean Bean looking for his wife, that would have been a little bit boring, perhaps. Which I believe is kind of more what they do in the sequel, Silent Hill Revelations, as far as I'm aware, which I haven't seen. So I think it kind of works, and I think as well with Radha Mitchell's portrayal of Rose Da Silva is she starts off being that Scream Queen-esque type character where it's very anything that she sees that frightens her, she just screams immediately. But then very quickly it shifts and she then becomes more of a focused and motivated character because she's looking for her daughter, and it's no longer, okay, yes, this is frightening, and yes, this is something that's horrible, but I have to do this. It's no longer, I'm just going to scream all the time, because again, that can get very grating, particularly across a long run time, as I mentioned before. So looking at how the film was made. So Christoph Gans obviously directed it, as I mentioned earlier, and apparently it took him about 5 years to gain the rights to this. It was something of a passion project for him. He fell in love with the game and he wanted to make the film, which again I think is always a good place to start from, because it means that you understand, particularly from a fan's perspective, what made the game successful, what made it what it was. It means that you're not coming at it going, well, I just want to do this particular thing, I don't care what the fans say, which can happen sometimes. So it meant that he had that kind of fan's perspective in his mind throughout the making. And he was given apparently the rights after Konami was sent a video of him describing how much it meant to him, the Silent Hill game, and apparently he made a very short and cheap version of some scenes from the game, and he overlaid that with the music from the game, and that's apparently what convinced Konami to go, okay, we're gonna, or maybe not convince them to make the film, but if we are going to make a film, we're going to give this person the rights to it so he can make it, because he seems to understand what it was we were trying to do with that original title. And I think that does come across. I think it always, the first thing I kind of thought when I was watching the first, few, the opening sequences was like, oh, this feels like somebody who understands the subject material, who understands the properties that they're working in. It doesn't feel like this person's lost it and doesn't know what they're doing. Very, to contrast, unlike what I found with Assassin's Creed and with Street Fighter. So again, that's, a really kind of key and integral point into what I think makes this film quite good, is that it has that fan's perspective throughout. And, in making the film, obviously you wanted to cast, some big names. So the role of Sybil Bennett, which was actually played by the woman from The Walking Dead, so Laurie Holden. So in that role, apparently he wanted Cameron Diaz. So, that tells you he has kind of, quite lofty hopes of the kind of stars he was going to be able to get. Apparently in the role of Rose, people like Meg Ryan, Emilia Jokovic were touted and talked about. Obviously, we know it didn't get to that point. We had Radha Mitchell. So, but there was lofty kind of ideas and thoughts in place about who they could have got for this film. One thing I think really does come across and really does add to this film and make it what it is the fact that the music, probably a lot of the fans will recognise the music. I didn't recognise the music because it's been a long, long time since I played the game. But my first kind of thought when I heard it was like, this feels like it could be in Silent Hill, the game. It doesn't feel out of place. It feels in keeping with that tone. And part of the reason for that is because he actually, used some of the music that was composed by Akira Yamaoka. However, the production contract meant that it couldn't just be, essentially copy and pasted from the game. So he actually had the composer come in and remix some of those tracks, and so that's why in some places it's almost built upon in that world, and it develops things further. So Jeff Dahmer came in and remixed some of those tracks, so it has that feel to it, but it's building upon it. As I said earlier, it's not just going, well, this is what the game has, so that's what we're going to do. It's not sitting on its laurels. It's kind of going, well, let's build upon it, let's make it something slightly different, but let's not lose what makes it what it is, which I think comes across fantastically with that score. So I mentioned obviously some of the creatures earlier, and the way they were portrayed in the film, and how that that's quite difficult, and it's a tough watch in places. The part of the reason for that, which I forgot to mention, was actually, for me, it was kind of the way they moved, which again was very in keeping with what I remember seeing in the game. So it had that as well. It's kind of a running theme of keeping that same tone that we had with the game, and that those movements from those creatures are just weird. That it doesn't feel like a natural kind of movement and the natural way of moving that we're used to seeing. And part of the reason for that is because Christoph Gans decided to cast dancers in those roles. So naturally they're a lot more flexible, they're a lot more nimble, so they're able to use their bodies in perhaps slightly different ways than a traditional actor, or so it's much more in that physical theatre kind of point of view. So those dancers have been able to kind of create the feel that we got in the games, and just having that ability to go, that's what we need here, rather than, okay, well, let's just cast some actors and ask them to walk a bit weird or walk a bit strange and walk in an unnatural way. They've actually gone, well, let's use dancers because they're generally speaking have more control over their body and the way in which they move. So again, another great decision there. Obviously, I did mention earlier about the world in which it creates. Silent Hill, the place, being quite an important part of the film. Naturally, it's the film's title, and if you get that wrong, it's very, very difficult to kind of work. To get to a place where people, are on board with what it is you're trying to do. So working on that means you've got to get that right. And, they filmed that in places like Brantford and Ontario in Canada. And it lasted around 4 days shooting that area. And the reason they chose that area apparently is because it was a decaying, downtown area, and it meant that they could use that without having to make many modifications. They didn't have to build much of a set to do this. They just used what they had and dressed it, for lack of a better term. And I think that, again, that comes across quite well, because it feels, whilst it does, obviously it feels, abandoned and, unused and empty, but it doesn't feel like it wasn't ever a town. It feels like at one point this would have been a thriving, bustling town, but because of the events of what's happened, now this is the position that it's in. So I think that, that choice again to go to a physical place and use what's there rather than just build a set. Obviously, well, I'd like to think it's cheaper because you haven't got to build anything, but I'm not sure if it's on, things like permits and stuff like that. So, but I would imagine it's a cheaper solution anyway. But actually, it means that it works for you. So it's, as those TikToks say, it's working smarter, not necessarily harder. So I think, that comes across quite well. So, that I've mentioned a few things there as to why I think this film works and why I think this comes across as one of the better video game adaptations. And I think one thing that this does quite well is it navigates that ability to tell the story that the game told through a different medium. Now, obviously, games, you play as the character, you physically are controlling the character, so it's going to be slightly different anyway. But it navigated being able to tell that story, built upon some of the things that came up in that first game, without ruining the legacy and without ruining why people have come to watch the film, and really sort of used it as a foundation rather than as ripping it off.
Quint's Offshore Fishing Trips. Brought to you by Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop. All are welcome. From fairy wells and dudes and Spanish ladies. No booking too big or too small, 'cause we have a bigger boat if needed. You go in boat goes in water, sharks in water. Book now for Quint's Offshore Fishing Trips at Quint's Bait and Tackle Shop, south of the pier, Martha's Vineyards. Please note, life jackets will not be supplied.
Exclusively only on Orangutan Records, Jake Fratelli sings the classics.
The next film that I think is a good example of a video game adaptation that got it right is 2002's Resident Evil. Now, obviously, this is another survival horror based game that the film focuses on. So perhaps some of the things are going to be similar similar in tone, but I think 2002's Resident Evil is a pretty decent film. I think it sets a solid foundation that unfortunately I think the rest of the franchise has kind of forgotten about and kind of moves past in a way that doesn't really feel in keeping with the series of the games and of the world in which the first film tries to create. Now, it's not a perfect movie. I'm definitely more of a fan of Resident Evil, the game series, than I am of Silent Hill. So I feel like I'm in a much kind of better place to perhaps talk about, those things transferring from game to film. I think on the whole, though, this does a fairly decent job and, becomes a fairly decent film as a result. So obviously this was, came out in 2002. So this was 6 years after the first game. By that point, we'd had, 3 Resident Evil games. So there was quite a lot of material to work off of when this film came out. So looking at the budget, it had $33 million budget. So, again, sizable chunk there. It made $17 million in its opening weekend. It made back $40 million in the US and Canada, so it's made its budget back and added another $7 million on top. And then worldwide in gross, again, similar to Silent Hill, made by a Japanese game company, so you're looking at more of an Asian audience potentially going to be clamoring to this. So it made back $102 million worldwide. So obviously Japanese fans will obviously know the game series as being Biohazard rather than Resident Evil, but it's same game there and same film. They've obviously gone for the Resident Evil title that US and Western audiences will know more familiar or be more familiar with. So the film crew, so it was directed and written by Paul W.S. Anderson, who has made a number of video game films. He also produced this along with Jeremy Bolt, Bernd Einger, Samuel Hadida, Marco Beltrami and Marilyn Manson composed some of the music here. Cinematographer was David Johnson, editor was Alexander Berner, casting directors were Robin Ray and Susan Smith, and production designer was Richard Bridgeland. And I think on the whole, this is a good crew making a good film here. Not that any of the other films are a bad crew or anything like that, but I think everything kind of works together in the way in which they work to create this film. I think the music is used to complement the feel of the film that they've created, which I think is obviously a good thing. The cinematography does similar sort of things. Obviously, it's all going to be overseen by the director, so I kind of understand that. But sometimes that doesn't always come across with films. Sometimes it can feel like a very fractured kind of process, and so that some things, don't feel like they're on the same wavelength as, some other elements of the film. Whereas I think here it gels in quite a good way. So, the way it's edited feels in keeping with the film they were trying to make, which is, as I say, isn't always the case. Moving over to the cast, I think this is on the whole, a pretty decent cast. So we're only going to really look at the main characters here and not the supporting zombies. But in the lead role, we have Mila Jovovich playing Alice. We have Eric Mabius playing Matt. We have Colin Salmon playing One. We have Martin Cruz playing Kaplan. We have Pascal Alerdi playing JD. We have Michelle Rodriguez playing Rain. We have James Purevoy playing Spence, and we have Michaela Dicker playing the Red Queen. So, again, some notable names there. I think the standout for me, and the thing that I'm drawn to the most here, is actually James Purevoy. I think he's an underrated actor. Questionable American accent, but you can only do your best, and I think he does it. It's never terrible, but there are points where I feel like if you'd have just had James Purevoy's, regular speaking voice, I think that would have been a much better call to make there. But it doesn't detract away from the film for me, so, it is what it is there. Obviously, we've got Mila Jovovich, who at this point, probably people would have known her mostly from The Fifth Element. So I think she adds a strong female lead character to the film, which I think is in keeping with the games. Obviously, I know the first game focused mostly on Chris Redfield, but you obviously have strong female characters like Jill Valentine, Claire Redfield, Ada Wong, strong female characters throughout the series. So it makes sense to have a female lead here. And actually, this is a film, although this is based on a survival horror game, and there are obviously massive horror elements, I'd say this moves a little bit more into the action kind of element rather than it being a out-and-out horror. And so Mila Jovovich, we know, can do those kinds of things from what we've seen her in before, and I think she adds that kick-ass kind of nature that we kind of need from that character, particularly towards the latter stages of the film. Eric Mabius, I think, is perhaps, for me, the one kind of character that feels the most out of place. He feels a little bit too clean cut and a little bit too pretty boy for me, but he doesn't detract away from the film. Colin Salmon, I think, unfortunately, he dies quite early on. I think he needs to have a little bit more time on screen. I think he plays that role kind of to perfection, that, leader of that, that SWAT team. I think that could have been developed a little bit further. Having said that, though, his death is perhaps the best death in the whole of that franchise, let alone the film. I think it's one of the most iconic kind of things that this film created for the Resident Evil series in cinema, at least. Martin Cruz plays the plays the tech genius, as part of that SWAT team, and I think he plays that role quite well. Obviously, we see him in the latter stages become a slightly more heroic character, but he plays that well. Pasquale Lurdy, becomes the first of the more prominent members of the SWAT team, to turn into a zombie, and the way that happens, I think, is a pretty good way to do that. And obviously, another strong female character, we have Michelle Rodriguez, who tends to play those characters, throughout her career, but again in here plays it to perfection. Plays Rain, that no nonsense, kick-ass kind of character. I think it really kind of works in what could be, or what could have been, a fairly macho type of cast here. As I said, James Purevoy, as I said previously, I think he works well in the narrative. We kind of always suspect that there's something a little bit more going on, and that he's a little bit more he has hidden ulterior motives that perhaps we're not completely sure on towards the beginning of the movie, and I think he does that well. He has that ability to change from a heroic character into a villainous character quite easily, which is strange why they didn't use his English accent, because Americans tend to do that quite a lot. I know Paul W.S. Anderson maybe that's why, because he's a British film director, but there you go. And obviously we got Michaela Dicker, who voices, and I believe is the person who does the Red Queen, which again I think it is a good idea. That the use of the Red Queen, I think, is a good narrative device to have a central villainous character, where it could have just been zombies. Having that Red Queen be the thing to focus everybody's kind of that's the villain in the piece, or the controlling element of the bad stuff that's going on. Obviously, as I alluded to, James Purevoy becomes that towards the end. But having that from the outset, and knowing, okay, the Red Queen is the thing that's controlling what's happening here. That's the reason why this is all gone to shit. That makes sense, because without that, zombie films can be a little bit by the numbers, in the sense of it's just how gory can the kills be, and here's another bunch of zombies, which by 2002 we'd seen quite a lot of zombie films, and it could have just been another one in the pack. It could, not that I'm saying it's a completely standout film, but it does certainly do things in a slightly different way to what we had seen before. I think, part of my fandom here, I think, would want it to perhaps follow the first game a little bit more in terms of its narrative. Obviously we see the mansion, and we see what they refer to as the hive. We see that. And obviously for fans of the game, and in fact, any of the series, know that usually you start out in what is a fairly, what I would say, so obviously it starts out with like a mansion, or like a big house, or a village area, and then we descend down into labs and into a much more technologically advanced area. And that's kind of like a common trope of the series, and obviously it does do that here, but I think it obviously does that. We see, for example, in the first game, I can remember playing it and being, walking around the mansion, and then eventually getting to the labs and being like, whoa, what? This is underneath the mansion. This is crazy. This isn't what I expected. And unfortunately, probably the biggest drawback I would say with that film is that we see that far too early on, and it kind of makes sense because of the story they're telling. Don't get me wrong, but I would have perhaps liked it if they'd have focused mostly on the mansion for, let's say, the first hour, and then we see it descend into the labs and into the hive and into that area there where people weren't necessarily expecting it. People weren't going into it going, oh, okay, well, it's just a hidden lab area underneath a mansion straight away. So that's probably the only thing. But having said that, by doing it, it is in keeping with that narrative and, you know, what we know of the game. So it's not completely detracting, it's just how they've decided to present it. So on one hand I'm going, well, I wish they'd explored that way of doing it in the game a little bit more, but on the other hand I'm going, it is still part of, you know, it's still using that as a basis and doing something slightly different. So I kind of understand that, and I kind of get it. I think here, one of the most notable standouts of the film and of the cinema version of Resident Evil is the music. You know, that kind of what I would call that techno new metal influence of the music and of that, you know, that initial tune that I'm not going to hum it because I won't do it justice, but go and listen to some of the soundtrack and listen to that, you know, that techno kind of influence music. It works so well in this instance. I think it's probably, as I say, the most notable thing about the Resident Evil film that kind of has that lasting legacy. I think it's one of the, I think it's probably one of the most underrated kind of like themes in cinema. I think it's not one that people go to a lot. Obviously, people go to the things of like John Williams and Hans Zimmer, etc., etc. But I think this one's quite an underrated one, and one that people forget about until they watch the film and they go, oh yeah, if they've seen it before, they go, oh yeah, oh yes, I remember that music. That music's great. That's fantastic. I love it. Or if they've not seen it, they go, oh, that's a nice bit of, I like that music, you know, it's in keeping, it feels in keeping with that tone. Obviously the games has a slightly more survival horror kind of aspect to it, and this film is slightly more action based, so it does differ in that particular way, but I don't think it differs in such a way that it doesn't feel related to that world that it creates. And I think that's a common theme, obviously, from Silent Hill here and Resident Evil and generally speaking video game adaptations, is that if it does venture away from what we know of the games, it does it in a way that feels like it's still part of that world. It doesn't ever feel like it's changing. You know, it's not revisionist history. It's not going, well, this is the world we're creating, it's different, and therefore this is actually what it should have been or what it could be. It's going, well, here's what we know, but we're just going to add some elements to that. We're going to build on it slightly, you know. And I think for the most part, Resident Evil and Silent Hill do that in a positive way, as I've mentioned. I think, you know, with Resident Evil, I think Apocalypse, you know, the sequel to this film, where I think that detracted slightly is I feel like that started to kind of go a little bit too much into fan service, you know, a little bit too much into, you know, just doing things for the sake of doing them rather than going, actually, why do we have that here? What's the reason in this film? What's the reason for that particular thing or that particular line or whatever it may be? I think in the second one, it becomes very much a wink, 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 nudge, nudge. Do you remember this? Well, that's what we're doing. Well, hey, here you go. You know that, don't you? It doesn't feel like that here. There's elements where it goes, if you know, you know, but it doesn't ever feel like it's kind of, you know, pandering in any kind of way. I think obviously, as I've mentioned, action is kind of more of a focus in this. Obviously there are those horror elements, but it's slightly more focused on action. And I think, as I said earlier, Mila Jovovich playing that lead character adds to that. I can remember that scene from the scene where she first encounters the zombie dogs. You know, that's quite a cool scene, and we see her kind of really start to, you know, use those skills that she's learned, and she's kind of, as I say, the amnesia of her is kind of going, actually, I have these skills and I have these things that I've learned, and I don't really know how I'm doing this. You know, I think that scene's pretty cool, and it's the first time we get to see her really sort of like start to kick ass. I think that's, you know, a good scene there, particularly where the dog jumps at her and she, you know, uses the wall and, almost parkours off of it. Parkour, little Office reference there. Parkours off of it and, flying kicks the dog. Feels very much like something that would happen in the game. So, it's keeping that element of the game series there. And I mentioned earlier, obviously, about Colin Salmon and his death. I think and it happens fairly early on. That's the only negative here, is that it happens fairly early on. I feel like the scene in terms of where it's placed in the film is perfect, because we get to see that pretty cool sequence early on, so it keeps us wanting more. I would just like to have seen Colin Salmon's character developed a little bit more and had more of a presence, but then it then does kind of fit in with what we know of the narrative of, Emilia Yorkovich's character Alice and James Purevoy, and obviously of Rain, played by Michelle Rodriguez. But that scene where they're going down that corridor and the lasers are coming out. For those who know. For those who don't, it starts off where you've got, I think, 4 members of this, elite squad, and one laser comes down at kind of like, head height, and so they all duck and it gets one of them. Then it comes down at sort of like mid-width height and it jumps up. So then Colin Salmon jumps up to the top of this corridor thing, grabs on and sort of like, planks himself up against the ceiling, and it just catches his knife, and then he drops down, and then it comes at him again, and just as it gets towards him, it then spins and goes into a lattice shape across the whole of the corridor. And it's that moment where he goes, it's that, I'm going to die here, there's nothing I can do, and it goes right through him. And the way it kind of does that is it focuses on him in a kind of foreground shot, and then in the background we see the other characters, and obviously we see the kind of remnants of these lasers and the lattice shape on his face. And just as we start to see more blood and we start to see his kind of face fall apart, it then changes focus to the characters in the background. I think that's a lovely bit of filmmaking there. It's a lovely shot. We see enough of it, but we don't see too much of it to us go, well, we've seen everything now, we don't need anything else of the film. We see, it's showed, leave you wanting more. Not quite show, don't tell, but it's very much in that, less is more kind of thing of going, well, I'm going to show you just enough of it, but not too much. I think that's really, really good. And it's interesting, we could have had a very, very different film. We could have had something completely different, because apparently Capcom were looking at, who could direct the film. And ultimately we know they worked with Paul W.S. Anderson. But initially, George A. Romero of obviously Night of the Living Dead and Dawn of the Dead and, that series of films, obviously very much an influence on the games of Resident Evil. So it's, not too much of a jump to make that kind of dispersion as to who's going to direct the film. But apparently he was originally attached to write, direct, but apparently left the project in, the late 90s over some differences around the script. So, not quite sure what those were, but apparently it was dormant for a while before Paul W.S. Anderson came on to write and direct. And apparently, again, a little bit similar to Christoph Gans in the Silent Hill situation, Paul Anderson wasn't necessarily a fan of the game, but then did decide to go and play the game, and apparently locked himself in a room for 4 weeks playing this game, back to back, playing the first 3. So, and apparently became obsessed with the game series as a result. And again, I think it's that thing of just, we can feel that level of fandom present in the film without it ever getting like they're just putting it in because that's what fans would like. So it gets to that point where we can see what we want from a fan's perspective, and we, for the most part, it kind of does what we want without it feel like it's pandering to us, which is a very, very difficult, fence to kind of balance on. But George A. Romero's scripts actually almost focused on, well, it did focus on Jill Valentine's character as the female lead. Obviously, Alice is a character created totally for the film, so we don't see, particularly not at that point. I don't think there has been an Alice character of the same ilk in the game since, but there wasn't one up to that point. And we have Jeremy Bolt to kind of thank for, you know, this film being made, because he was the one who Paul W.S. Anderson contacted him and said, I've got to make these films, and he then went off and, you know, worked together on that. So we've got a little bit of thanks there for Jeremy Bolt. So as we know, in the film, the Lickers are some of the creatures that we see from the games that are in the film, and apparently 2 full-scale ones were made for the film, one of which was more detailed than the other and was capable of, you know, a lot of more movement, so it could do those things that we see from the games and jump around and be quite a menacing figure, and the other one was obviously used for wider shots and things like that. And obviously they combined that a little bit with CGI, which holds up relatively well in 2024, 22 years later. We can see it's CGI. We can see that it's not the greatest CGI, but it holds up relatively well. Whether or not we'll be saying that in 10 years' time, I'm not sure. So, and, you know, a little bit like our Jurassic Park episode where we say, you know, those elements that work is in Jurassic Park is because it has a mixture between, you know, physical full-scale models and animatronics and CGI. It has a mixture. It doesn't ever show you too much where you go, well, I know that's CGI and it looks shoddy, it looks awful. Resident Evil here has that mix, and we go a little bit here, a little bit there, and it's just enough of one of the other without it being too much, without it being, you know, starting to see that, you know, the cracks appear, for lack of a better term. And again, we almost, because of studio interference, almost got a very different film. Now, this film was obviously rated R because of, you know, some of the gore and some of the violent and language and whatever that it's used. But it could have almost been a PG-13 movie, which, how do you make a survival horror movie that's PG-13? I don't know. I don't understand how. I can understand perhaps wanting to focus a film to get mostly, you know, a wider range of audience. I get that, but let's not make a Resident Evil game that's going to be that. So that could have very much ruined the film. But luckily, that didn't happen. And Paul W.S. Anderson was able to kind of sit there and go, no, actually, this needs to be rated R. Rather than being a yes man and being a people pleaser, he kind of stood up for what he believed in that respect, which I think is to the, you know, the positive aspects of this film. How do you make a survival horror that's PG-13? You just don't. It doesn't work. It's never going to work. And I always find with studios when they interfere, obviously we know they're there to look at money and things like that, but sometimes it's like not being able to see past the immediate thing. Like, yes, okay, you may be able to make a film and it may initially make more money because it appeals to a wider audience, but if the film's rubbish, it's then not necessarily going to make that much money past that point. People may flock to see it to begin with, but then once they see it, they're not going to recommend it. Whereas if you make a good film, yes, okay, you're targeting yourself towards a certain market, but if it's good, people will tell their friends, tell the people who are also interested in that thing to go and see it. You can then make much more money on merchandise and things like that. So sometimes it's just being patient, I think, rather than going, we need a PG-13 movie because that appeals to more people. It just seems a very short-sighted kind of view, in my opinion. And case in point, its successful opening weekend sparked a frenzy among the studios out in the US, you know, looking to capitalise on video games and those adaptions. And some of the ones that they immediately went and, you know, striked up, the IPs for was Doom, which eventually got made into a film starring Carl Urban and Dwayne Johnson. Terrible film. absolutely awful. Could have been in our, video game films that got it wrong. Could have been there, but I didn't want to put myself through that quite as much. Silent Hill, as we mentioned, luckily that was made well, and Max Payne was an honourable mention in the last episode. So, particularly Doom and Max Payne, we kind of have Resident Evil to thank or blame, as the case may be, for that. But we also have Silent Hill to thank for Resident Evil. Resident Evil to thank for Silent Hill in that respect. But clashes with studios were quite a common theme for Paul W.S. Anderson. Obviously, a great film that he made previously was Event Horizon. A fantastic horror film, one of the most underrated horror films I think of the 90s, maybe of all time, because I don't think enough people have seen it and know about it. Go and watch it if you haven't, because it's so good. I think that was kind of, for me, knowing that he made Event Horizon, you kind of go, well, no wonder he's made a good Resident Evil film, because he has those horror, he has those horror elements and horror roots. So because of those interferences that he had on Event Horizon, it kind of, prompted him and caused him to seek some financing in Europe that came from Germany's Constantine Film and UK's New Legacy. Sony Screen Gems picked up the movie for distribution halfway through the production. So the fact that he's done that, he's kind of gone, well, I don't want too much studio interference here. Obviously, we know they wanted a PG-13 film, but he stood his ground and, we got what we wanted in that respect. And actually, having a director to do that and go, this is the film I'm going to make, this is what I want to do, is not always a good thing, as we know. Not always a good thing, because sometimes directors need to be reined in and said, no, that's not going to work, you need to do this. But in this instance, I think is a good thing. As case in point, as I mentioned earlier with the music, great decisions and choices made by Paul W.S. Anderson to, hire somebody like Marco Beltrami and Marilyn Manson, to create that edgy score, very, very much in keeping with John Carpenter's kind of early films. It's very similar, has, the music does have elements of Halloween in there, has elements of, They Live, has elements of The Thing, elements of, Escape from New York and LA, has those elements in there, very much in keeping with John Carpenter. So, little nods to that horror background and that horror, that horror legacy that they, another director who perhaps could have done something very, very different that we wouldn't be talking about now, and we wouldn't be saying is a good thing, and we wouldn't be saying, so sometimes we just need to let directors do their thing, and only when it feels like they're getting out of hand do studios need to kind of, take a step forward and go, what are we doing here? So, in closing, video game adaptations. We've looked at ones that don't work in the last episode, and we've looked at ones that do work. So, what makes these two films successful? Well, I think I've kind of summarised, but I'll just go over it one more time. I say it's building on the legacy of the film, building on the legacy of the games, taking what we love about the games and saying we're going to keep that there, but we're going to add to it without ever detracting away from what we like about that element in the first place. Not going, I'm going to change this for the sake of changing it. Having that in there and go, well, that thing that you love, we're going to have that, but we're going to do something ever so slightly that different that you haven't seen before. Sometimes that's a tricky ship to sail, because you're trying to navigate a very close to the wire, in the sense of people will look at things and go, well, I didn't want that, I wanted this. And you almost sometimes have to kind of just trust that what you're doing is going to work. So I get that. But it's keeping the feel and the vibe of a film or vibe of a game sometimes, because those mediums are so different that it may always be a little bit difficult to to navigate. But having that, that nuance and that ability to go, what made that game successful? What is it people liked about that? Can we put that thing directly in there, or do we have to change it in some way? Okay, we have to change it. Well, how do we change it without losing the vibe or losing the feeling? That's the thing that's going to be difficult. That's the thing that takes a shrewd hand to have to kind of navigate. And I think particularly in Christoph Gans with Silent Hills, and particularly in Paul W.S. Anderson's in regards to Resident Evil, they do that, not perfectly, but they do that on the whole quite well. And I don't think there's a set formula to be followed. I think you have to kind of look at each video game adaptation as its own entity. Look at look at that particular that game, and try and ask yourself, how is this going to work in film? Now, I'm not saying people don't do that. I'm sure they do. But almost look at it and go, well, we're not just going to make a film of that game. We're going to make a film that keeps with that legacy, almost as if you were doing a sequel to a franchise. What can we do that is in keeping with that legacy? And as we know from the sequels episodes that we've done, that can be difficult as well. But we have to kind of we have to have filmmakers that look at games when they're going to make a film of them and go, what is it fans love? How can we get that onto screen? And what do we need to avoid? What do we stop doing? In Street Fighter's case, nods and winks to the camera every 5 seconds about this is that, this is this. In this instance, winks and nods to the camera weren't used in Silent Hill, and they weren't used in Resident Evil. There were things that they go, if you know, but it works for an audience who haven't played the games, because ultimately that's the whole reason for making a film, is because you're trying to appeal to an audience that isn't just people who play video games. You're appealing to a wider audience, so it has to work on its own individual merit. And I think Silent Hill and I think Resident Evil definitely do that.
Now, you could be forgiven for thinking you're listening to a Spaniard ordering a beer on the Costa del Sol. You could almost feel the sun beating down on his bullfighting cape. But what you were actually listening to was me, Sean Connery, displaying just one of the many accents that you too can master at the Sean Connery Dialect School for Actors. Now let me transport you to a Cold War era Russian submarine with flawless Russian dialect. This is my boat now, Captain Phillips. That was magic. You can learn this and many more at the Sean Connery Dialect School for Actors. Here end of the lesson.
Unfortunately, that brings us on to the end of the episode. We hope you've enjoyed listening. Don't forget to follow us from wherever you get your podcasts from, and also head over to our social media platforms in order to stay up to date. So until next time, he's been Jimmy Murphy, I've been Ryan Etherington, and we have been Bury Our Bones with Cinema. Be a one-button job. Boom, 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 toom, toom, toom.
I have a terrible tendency to just scroll about if you're talking, when we're doing it, I still find it slightly distracting.
It's a bit weird, but I think it's a bit weird, but I suppose...
maybe if you listen to it back, see if it sounds... I was like, I'm going to have to stop it. Because you listen to it back, like...
that well, wasn't it?